Before we begin, if you find yourself wandering through the quiet hours of the night, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that straddle the line between the absurd and the somnolent. Tonight's story is for those who have ever dreamed too boldly or too foolishly. Chapter 1. The Peasant's Grand Delusion. In the kingdom of Almira, where the cobblestones were perpetually slick with rain, and the nobility's disdain for commoners was as reliable as the tides, there lived a peasant named Aldrich. Aldrich was not remarkable in any particular way, save for one fatal flaw. He had read too many ballads. The troubadours who passed through his village sang of gallant knights and winsome ladies, of love won through grand gestures and poorly tuned lutes. These tales festered in Aldrich's mind like a rot, convincing him that destiny had reserved for him a princess hand, if only he had the courage to seize it. Aldrich's days were spent knee-deep in the muck of Farmer Hobbs' turnip fields, but his nights were devoted to fantasy. He would stare at the distant spires of Castle Valmire, where Princess Seraphina, said to be as cold as she was beautiful, resided. The bards claimed she had rejected 100 suitors, each richer and handsomer than the last. To Aldrich, this was not a deterrent but an invitation. If no man of noble birth could win her, then surely the solution was a man of no birth at all. Thus began Aldrich's great undertaking. He would woo the princess with nothing but his audacity, and a lute he fashioned from an old washboard and some twine. The instrument, when plucked, produced a sound not unlike a cat being stepped upon. But Aldrich, in his delusion, believed it was the voice of angels. He practiced nightly, serenading the skeptical cows in Farmer Hobbs' pasture, convinced their blank stares were signs of awe. One evening, emboldened by a particularly potent tankard of sour ale, Aldrich declared his intentions to the village. The reaction was less than encouraging. Old Nan, who sold cabbages by the road, laughed so hard she spat out her tooth. The blacksmith's son clapped him on the back, and asked if he'd like his skull measured for a helmet, just in case the princess's guards decided to test its durability. Even the local dogs, usually indifferent to human folly, seemed to eye him with pity. Undeterred, Aldrich set off at dawn, his lute strapped to his back and a wilted daisy clutched in his hand. The journey to Castle Valmire was a 2-day trudge through mud and misfortune. He slept under hedges, dined on stolen apples, and twice had to outrun a particularly territorial goose. By the time he reached the castle gates, he was sunburned, flea-bitten, and smelled distinctly of damp hay. The guards at the gate, clad in polished steel and expressions of profound boredom, regarded him as one might a persistent stain. "State your business," the taller one grunted. Aldrich drew himself up to his full height, which was not very tall, and announced, "I am here to win the heart of Princess Seraphina with a song of my own making." The guards exchanged a glance. Then, to Aldrich's surprise, they stepped aside. It was not courtesy that moved them, but the certainty that the princess' reaction would be more entertaining than another hour of standing in silence. Aldrich, mistaking their indifference for encouragement, marched into the courtyard with the confidence of a man who had not yet realized he was doomed. Princess Seraphina was holding court in the garden, surrounded by fawning nobles and a small army of attendants. She was, as the stories promised, breathtakingly beautiful, with hair like spun gold, and a smile as warm as a winter's frost. When Aldrich approached, the crowd parted, not out of respect but morbid curiosity. Aldrich knelt, or rather tripped into a kneeling position, and presented his daisy. "My lady," he declared, "I bring you the humble tribute of my heart and a song worthy of your grace." The princess arched a perfect eyebrow. "A song, you say?" Her voice was like honey laced with arsenic. Aldrich, deaf to the danger, nodded eagerly and began to play. The first note alone was enough to make several courtiers visibly recoil. The second caused a nearby page to drop his tray. By the third, even the princess's icy composure cracked, her lips twitching in what might have been horror or amusement. It was hard to tell. Aldrich, lost in his performance, did not notice. He sang of love, of destiny, of turnips. He got sidetracked, his voice wavering between a warble and a whine. When he finished, the garden was silent. Then Princess Serafina clapped, once, slowly. "Tat," she said, "was the most excruciating experience of my life." Aldrich beamed. "Thank you, my lady." The princess sighed. "Guards, throw him in the dungeons." As Aldrich was dragged away, still clutching his lute, he called over his shoulder, "I shall return, my love. This is but the first act of our romance." The princess turned to her closest adviser. "Remind me to have the troubadours banned. They're giving the peasants ideas." And so Aldrich found himself in a cell, his grand delusion intact, his lute confiscated, and his only companion a disinterested rat. But in his heart, the flame of hope burned undimmed. After all, every ballad had its trials. This was merely his. Meanwhile, in the castle above, Princess Serafina poured herself a goblet of wine and resolved to never, under any circumstances, attend another open court. Chapter 2. The road to the castle. Aldrich's journey to Castle Valmir had begun with the kind of optimism that only exists in those who have never attempted anything difficult. He had imagined a brisk, heroic stroll through sun-dappled meadows, birds serenading him as he went, perhaps a friendly squirrel or two offering guidance. Reality, as it often does, had other plans. The first obstacle presented itself not 10 minutes outside the village, in the form of a goose. Not just any goose, this was a creature of singular malice, a feathered tyrant who ruled the narrow bridge over Crumblebrook with an iron beak. It had sent children, merchants, and even the occasional stray dog fleeing in terror. Aldrich, who had no prior experience with avian despots, assumed his usual strategy of smiling nervously and hoping for the best would suffice. He approached the bridge with cautious steps. The goose, perched atop a mossy stone like a tiny feathered gargoyle, fixed him with a stare that could curdle milk. Aldrich cleared his throat. "Good morning, fine goose. Lovely weather for, bridge guarding." The goose hissed. Aldrich took a step back. "Right, well, I'll just be on my way then." He attempted to sidle past. The goose exploded into motion, wings flapping like a deranged windmill, beak snapping at his ankles with the precision of a seasoned torturer. Aldrich yelped and broke into a run, the goose in hot pursuit. He made it halfway across the bridge before tripping over his own feet and landing face first in the mud. The goose, satisfied with this humiliation, waddled back to its throne, leaving Aldrich to pick himself up, damp and defeated. Shaking mud from his sleeves, Aldrich pressed onward. The road to the castle was little more than a glorified goat path, winding through fields and forests with the meandering indecision of a drunkard's stroll. By midday, his stomach was growling louder than Farmer Hobbs' old plow horse. He paused by a gnarled apple tree, its branches heavy with fruit, just out of reach. Aldrich was not a tall man, nor a particularly coordinated one. His first attempt to jump for an apple ended with him sprawled in the dirt. His second attempt sent a shower of leaves raining down, but no fruit. His third attempt dislodged a single worm-riddled apple, which hit him squarely on the forehead. He ate it anyway. As he chewed, a voice rang out from the bushes. "Stand and deliver." Aldrich froze, apple halfway to his mouth. A figure stepped onto the path, a man in a tattered cloak, brandishing what appeared to be a butter knife. "Your money or your life," the man intoned, though he sounded more like a clerk announcing tax season than a fearsome highwayman. Aldrich squinted. "You're the tax collector from Willowbrook." The man's shoulders slumped. "Blast! I was hoping the cloak would disguise me." He tugged at the frayed fabric. "It's just... the king raised the levy again, and my wife says if I come home without enough coin for a new cooking pot, she'll..." He mimed a strangling motion. "So I thought, why not try robbery? It can't be harder than collecting taxes from people who don't have any." Aldrich nodded sympathetically. I don't have any money either. The tax collector sighed. Figures. Well, if you ever do come into some, remember me. Harold of Willowbrook. I'll give you a discount on the robbery. With that, he trudged back into the underbrush, muttering about ungrateful peasants and the price of copper pots. Aldrich resumed his trek, the encounter leaving him oddly cheered. If even the tax collector was struggling, perhaps his own quest wasn't so foolish after all. The afternoon brought new challenges. A sudden downpour turned the road into a river of mud, soaking Aldrich to the bone. His lute, strapped to his back, emitted a sorrowful squelch with every step. Then came the swarm of bees, attracted by the flower he'd tucked into his belt for the princess. He abandoned dignity entirely, sprinting down the road with arms flailing, until he tripped over a root and landed in a ditch. The bees, uninterested in further sport, buzzed away. By nightfall, Aldrich was a sorry sight, mud-caked, bee-stung, and clutching his now slightly dented lute like a drowning man grips a plank of wood. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of unseen creatures, none of which sounded friendly. He considered turning back. Perhaps Farmer Hob would take him back. Perhaps the goose would accept his surrender. But then he thought of Princess Seraphina, her cold beauty, the way she had looked at him as if he were something stuck to her shoe. A man could drown in that disdain, and Aldrich was nothing if not a willing swimmer. He curled up under a tree, lute cradled to his chest, and dreamed of grand ballrooms and royal favor. The tree, for its part, dripped rainwater onto his face all night, as if nature itself were trying to dissuade him. Dawn arrived, gray and damp. Aldrich's bones ached, his stomach growled, and his left boot had developed a suspicious squelch, but Castle Valmera's towers were now visible in the distance, piercing the morning mist like needles. He adjusted his lute, squared his shoulders, and set off again. The road had tested him, but he was still standing. Mostly. Unbeknownst to Aldrich, Princess Seraphina was at that very moment receiving a report from her guards. My lady, the peasant from yesterday has escaped the dungeons. The princess sipped her tea. Let me guess, he's coming back. The guard nodded. He stole a spoon and said something about serenading you at moonrise. Seraphina set down her cup. Double the guards, and for the love of the kingdom, someone confiscate all the spoons. Chapter 3. A most unimpressive arrival. Aldrich's first glimpse of Castle Valmera's gates should have filled him with awe. The towering stone archway, the banners fluttering in the breeze, the glint of sunlight on polished armor. It was the stuff of ballads. Instead, all he could think about was how badly his feet hurt. His boots, which had never been particularly sturdy to begin with, had given up entirely somewhere around the 3rd mile, and he now shuffled forward, with all the grace of a man who had just been kicked by a mule. The guards at the gate were, to put it mildly, unimpressed. The taller of the two, a man with a jaw like a brick and eyebrows that could have doubled as thatched roofs, squinted at Aldrich as he approached. State your business, he grunted, in a tone that suggested he already regretted asking. Aldrich straightened up as best he could, which still left him several inches shorter than the guard's shoulder. I am Aldrichoff, well, nowhere important, real. And I have come to— Turnip salesman, the guard interrupted, eyeing the mud caked on Aldrich's trousers with distaste. Aldrich blinked. What? No, We've got enough turnips, the guard said, waving a hand. Try the next kingdom over. Heard they've got a shortage. Aldrich looked down at himself. True, he did bear a passing resemblance to a root vegetable at the moment, dirty, slightly misshapen, and smelling vaguely of earth. But he was not about to let this stand. I am not here to sell turnips, he said with as much dignity as a man in his position could muster. I am here to win the heart of Princess Seraphina. The guards exchanged a glance. The shorter one, a wiry fellow with a nose that had clearly been broken multiple times, snorted. Again? Aldrich frowned. Again? The taller guard sighed. You're the third one this week. At least the other two bathe first. Aldrich opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, the gates creaked open just enough to admit a harried-looking servant balancing a tray of what appeared to be half-eaten pastries. The smell hit Aldrich like a fist, and his stomach let out a sound that could only be described as plaintive. The servant paused, eyeing Aldrich with the same expression one might reserve for a suspicious stain. "You here for the scraps?" he asked, gesturing to the tray. Aldrich hesitated. On one hand, pride. On the other, a pastry that still had at least 2 good bites left in it. His stomach made the decision for him. As he shoved the remnants of a raspberry tart into his mouth, and possibly a few fingers in his haste, the servant sighed. "Look, if you're not a turnip salesman or here for the scraps, what do you want?" Aldrich swallowed. "I told you. The princess." The servant's expression shifted from weary to outright pitying. "Oh, you're one of those?" He turned to the guards. "Just let him in. She'll deal with him." The taller guard shrugged and stepped aside. Aldrich, pastry crumbs still clinging to his chin, stumbled forward into the courtyard. It was, in a word, overwhelming. The castle grounds were a riot of color and noise. Nobles in silk and velvet strolled between manicured hedges, servants darted to and fro like startled rabbits, and somewhere in the distance a lute was being played very badly. Aldrich's own instrument, strapped to his back, gave a sympathetic twang as if in solidarity. He had barely taken 2 steps before a voice cut through the din. "You, peasant." Aldrich turned to see a woman in a dress so elaborate it could have housed a small family. Her hair was piled atop her head in a structure that defied gravity, and her expression suggested she had just smelled something unpleasant. "Yes," he said, attempting a bow, and nearly toppling over. The woman's lip curled. "The princess is holding court in the solar. If you're here to waste her time, at least have the decency to do it where we can all laugh at you." Aldrich opened his mouth to respond, but the woman had already swept away, her skirts billowing like the sails of a ship. The solar, as it turned out, was a sunlit room at the top of a truly unreasonable number of stairs. By the time Aldrich reached the top, he was wheezing like an overworked bellows and seriously reconsidering his life choices. The room itself was beautiful. Tapestries lined the walls, sunlight streamed through tall windows, and at the far end, perched on a chair that was practically a throne, sat Princess Seraphina. She was, if possible, even more beautiful than Aldrich remembered. Her golden hair was bound up in an intricate braid, her gown was the color of a winter sky, and her expression was the same one might wear when noticing a persistent stain on the ceiling. Aldrich took a deep breath, adjusted his lute, and stepped forward. A servant blocked his path. "Name in business," he said, in a tone that suggested he already knew both, and regretted them deeply. Aldrich swallowed. "Aldrich off, well, nowhere important here, too?" "Serenaded the princess, yes, we know," the servant said, rolling his eyes. He turned to the room at large. "Another one, my lady." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles. Someone snickered. Princess Seraphina sighed. "Let him approach," she said in a voice that could have frozen fire. Aldrich stumbled forward, his heart pounding. This was it. The moment he had dreamed of. He dropped to one knee, a move that was becoming uncomfortably familiar, and brandished his lute. "My lady," he began, "I have traveled far too." "Oh, for pity's sake," the princess interrupted. "If you're going to play, just play. I haven't got all day." Aldrich blinked. "Right, yes, of course." He fumbled with his lute, fingers suddenly clumsy. The first note he struck was less a musical tone, and more the sound of a dying animal. The nobles winced. The princess closed her eyes as if praying for strength. Undeterred, Aldrich launched into his song, a ballad he had composed himself, titled, "Ode to a Princess Who Definitely Doesn't Hate Me Yet." It was, in his opinion, a masterpiece. The world, as usual, disagreed. By the second verse, several nobles had discreetly covered their ears. One had begun edging toward the door. The princess' expression had settled into something resembling resigned horror. Aldrich, lost in his own performance, didn't notice. He sang of love, of destiny, of the time he had accidentally eaten a bad mushroom and seen what he was pretty sure was a sign from the gods. It had been a squirrel, but the metaphor still stood. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, the princess began to clap. Once, twice, 3 times. "That," she said, "was the worst thing I have ever heard." Aldrich beamed. "Thank you, my lady." The princess turned to her guards. "Throw him in the dungeons." Again. As Aldrich was dragged away, still clutching his lute, he called over his shoulder, "I'll write you another song, a better one, with more rhyming." The princess pinched the bridge of her nose. "Someone find me a drink, a strong one." And so Aldrich found himself back in a cell, his dreams of royal romance undimmed, his lute slightly more battered, and his only company a rat who looked at him with what might have been sympathy. Or maybe it was just judging him. It was hard to tell with rats. Chapter 4. The Princess's Bored Gaze. Princess Serafina had endured many tedious court events in her lifetime. There had been the summer solstice banquet, where the roast peacock had inexplicably contained 3 separate knives hidden in its cavity. There had been the winter masque, where Duke Elric had mistaken her for his deceased wife and attempted to waltz with her into a decorative pond. And then, of course, there had been the infamous poetry gala of 8, where Baron Vilnius had recited an epic ode to his own mustache for 3 uninterrupted hours. But this was something new. Seated upon her gilded chair in the castle's grand hall, Serafina surveyed the latest batch of suitors, with the enthusiasm of someone watching paint dry. They were, as always, a collection of preening nobles, each more convinced of their own charm than the last. Lord Herrick was currently droning on about his ancestral lands, his voice as thrilling as a lecture on turnip rotation. Lady Breezeeyes had brought a lute and was plucking at it with all the skill of a concussed chicken. And then, of course, there was the peasant. Aldrich had somehow escaped the dungeons again. Serafina wasn't entirely sure how he kept managing this. The castle guards were supposed to be competent. But then again, so were the court jesters. And look how that had turned out. He stood near the back of the hall, clutching a scrap of parchment like it was a sacred text. His hair was sticking up in odd directions, as if he'd been struck by lightning and forgotten to mention it. His tunic had been patched in at least 4 visible places, and his boots were less footwear and more abstract art. Serafina sighed and signaled for another goblet of wine. Aldrich, sensing his moment, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "My lady," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "I have composed a poem in your honor." The hall fell into a hush that was less respectful and more morbidly curious. Aldrich unfolded his parchment with great ceremony, took a deep breath, and began. "O princess fair, with eyes so bright, like stars that grace the velvet night, or possibly like polished coal. I'm bad with metaphors, my soul." A stifled snort came from somewhere in the crowd. Serafina didn't react, but her grip on her goblet tightened slightly. Aldrich pressed on, undeterred. "Your beauty doth my heart ensnare, like rabbit caught in hunter's snare. Though rabbits scream, you do not screech, a trait I find most." "Enough." Serafina's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Aldrich blinked. "I wasn't finished. There's a whole stanza about your hair being like—" "I don't care." Serafina set down her goblet with deliberate slowness. Aldrich's shoulders slumped. "Dungeons again?" The princess considered this. "No, I think we'll try something new today. She gestured to the captain of the guard. "Throw him in the moat." Aldrich's eyes widened. But there's algae in the moat." Serafina smiled faintly. "Yes, and?" As the guards dragged him away, Aldrich twisted to call over his shoulder, "I'll write you a better poem. One with more similes, fewer rodents." The princess waved a hand dismissively and turned her attention to the next suitor, a duke who was attempting to impress her by balancing a spoon on his nose. She wondered, not for the first time, if abdication was still an option. Meanwhile, outside, Aldrich hit the moat with a splash that sent several ducks fleeing in alarm. He surfaced, sputtering, to find a small crowd of servants gathered on the bank watching with interest. One of them tossed him a rope. "You're the third this week," the servant said as Aldrich hauled himself out, dripping in algae streaked. "Her Highness must like you. She only threw the other two once." Aldrich wrung out his tunic, considering this. "You think so?" The servant shrugged. "Either that or she's hoping you'll drown." Aldrich nodded thoughtfully. "I should write a poem about this. Ode to a moat most green. No, wait." The servant walked away before he could finish. Back in the hall, Princess Serafina had reached her limit. She stood abruptly, silencing the current suitor mid-sentence. "Court is dismissed." The nobles blinked. "But, Your Highness," I said, dismissed. Her tone left no room for argument. As the hall emptied, Serafina's advisor, a wizened old man named Fendrel, approached. "You're being unusually harsh on that peasant," he observed. Serafina arched a brow. "Am I?" Fendrel chuckled. "You've had men thrown in the dungeons for less. The moat is practically a compliment." Serafina didn't respond, but as she turned to leave, Fendrel caught the faintest hint of a smirk. Outside, Aldrich sat on the castle steps, shivering but undaunted. His poem was ruined, his clothes were ruined, and his pride was, well, that had never been intact to begin with. But none of that mattered, because the princess had looked at him. Really looked at him. And for Aldrich, that was enough. For now. Chapter 5. The Lute Incident. Aldrich had spent 3 days in the castle stables, nursing his wounded pride and a considerable case of algae rash before he arrived at a conclusion. He needed a new strategy. The poetry had been a disaster. The serenading had been worse. But he still had one weapon left in his arsenal, his lute. Or rather what remained of it. The original lute, crafted from a washboard and twine, had met its end in the moat, dissolving into something resembling soggy kindling. Undeterred, Aldrich had scavenged materials from the castle kitchens. A dried gourd that had probably been meant for soup, some dubious fishing line from a distracted guard, and a bent spoon for tuning pegs. The result was, in his opinion, a masterpiece. In reality, it looked like something a deranged squirrel might build after a long night of questionable decisions. He tuned it carefully, or at least he turned the spoon pegs until the fishing line stopped making a noise like a dying crow. Satisfied, he tucked it under his arm and set off for the great hall, where Princess Serafina was holding afternoon court. The hall was, as usual, packed with nobles vying for the princess's attention. Duke Elric was attempting to demonstrate his prowess with a sword, though he was currently struggling to unsheath it from its scabbard. Lady Briseis was reciting a sonnet, her voice trembling with what might have been passion or possibly indigestion. And in the corner, a minor baron was quietly losing a game of chess to himself. Aldrich took a deep breath and stepped forward. "My lady," he announced, "I have composed a new song in your honor." The room fell silent. The nobles turned, their expressions a mix of amusement and horror. Princess Serafina, seated on her throne, did not look up from the parchment she was reading. Aldrich swallowed and plucked the first note. The gourd lute responded with a sound not unlike a stepped-upon frog. A titter ran through the crowd. Aldrich ignored it and launched into his song, a rousing ballad he had titled "Woe to the princess who definitely doesn't hate me as much as she thinks she does." The first verse went reasonably well if one considered not causing immediate vomiting a success. The second verse was where things began to unravel. He strummed a particularly enthusiastic chord. The fishing line, strained beyond its limits, snapped with a teet twang that echoed through the hall. The gourd, suddenly free of tension, split neatly in two, showering the nearest nobles with seeds and pulp. The spoon pegs flew off in opposite directions, one hitting Duke Elric square in the forehead, the other landing with eye Ploy in Lady Brise's goblet of wine. For a moment, there was silence. Then the hall erupted. Duke Elric howled, clutching his forehead. Lady Brise shrieked and upended her goblet, sending wine splashing across the hem of her gown. The minor baron, who had been mid-move in his chess game, startled so badly he knocked over the entire board. And the nobles, oh, the nobles laughed. Not the polite, courtly laughter reserved for jests and clever wordplay. This was the kind of laughter that came from deep in the belly, the kind that left one wheezing and wiping tears from their eyes. They pointed. They gasped for breath. One particularly portly earl actually fell off his bench. Aldrich stood frozen, clutching the remnants of his lute, his face burning. And then, a single, clear sound cut through the chaos. Princess Serafina had laughed. It was not a giggle, not a chuckle. It was a full, rich laugh, the kind that transformed her usually icy expression into something warm and alive. She caught herself almost immediately, pressing a hand to her mouth, but it was too late. Aldrich had heard it. He straightened, his humiliation momentarily forgotten. "My lady," he said, voice trembling only slightly, "if my suffering brings you joy, then let me assure you, I have many more talents to embarrass myself with." Whoa. The nobles, still recovering, groaned. Serafina composed herself, though the ghost of a smile still lingered at the corners of her lips. "I don't doubt that," she said dryly. Aldrich beamed. Then the princess sighed. Aldrich Aldrich's smile didn't falter. "Dungeons. No, Serafina tilted her head, considering. "The kitchens. If he's going to steal gourds, he might as well make himself useful." And so Aldrich found himself escorted to the castle kitchens, where the head cook, a formidable woman with forearms like ham hocks, eyed him with deep suspicion. "You're the gourd thief," she said flatly. Aldrich held up the remains of his lute. "In my defense, it was for art." The cook snatched the broken gourd from his hands. "Art," she muttered. "Right. You can peel potatoes. And if I catch you near the vegetables again, I'll peel you." Aldrich nodded eagerly. "Understood. Thus, to clarify, are tubers considered vegetables? Because if I could borrow a beat, I had an idea for a drum." The cook threw a potato at his head. Meanwhile, back in the great hall, Princess Serafina dismissed the remaining courtiers and retreated to her chambers. Her advisor, Fendrel, followed, his expression unreadable. "You laughed," he observed. Serafina did not look at him. "I did no such thing." Fendrel smirked. "Of course not. My mistake." The princess hesitated, then said, very quietly, "He's ridiculous." "Yes," Fendrel agreed. "But persistent." Serafina said nothing. But later that evening, when the kitchens reported that the peasant had somehow turned potato peeling into a musical performance and subsequently been banished to the scullery, she did not order him thrown into the moat. Progress, Aldrich decided as he scrubbed pots with a rhythm only he could hear, was being made. Chapter 6. A Duel with a Spoon. Aldrich had been in the castle kitchens for 3 days, and in that time he had learned 3 important truths. First, that castle potatoes came in numbers he had previously believed to be mathematically impossible. Second, that head cook Mistress Drell had at least 4 different wooden spoons, each with its own distinct personality and capacity for violence. And third, that the kitchen staff had started taking bets on how long it. None of this knowledge prepared him for what happened when Lord Brisford entered the kitchen. Lord Brisford was, by all accounts, the sort of nobleman who made other noblemen look humble. His family was wealthy enough to buy a small country. His lineage stretched back to at least 3 different legendary heroes, all of whom he mentioned regularly. And his opinion of himself was so high that he occasionally got altitude sickness from it. He was also Princess Seraphina's most persistent suitor, a fact that seemed to annoy her almost as much as Aldrich's existence did. And now he was standing in the kitchen doorway, his silk doublet spotless, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his expression one of deep offense, as if the mere sight of a peasant was a personal insult. "You," he said, pointing at Aldrich with a gloved hand, "are the peasant who has been harassing Her Highness." Aldrich, who was elbow-deep in potato peelings, blinked. "Harassing is a strong word. I prefer persistently serenading." Brisford's nostrils flared. "You are a stain upon this court. A blemish." "Turnip salesman?" Aldrich offered. The Lord's face darkened. "I challenge you to a duel." The kitchen, which had been a symphony of chopping and bubbling pots, fell abruptly silent. Even Mistress Drell paused in her stirring. Aldrich carefully set down his knife. "A duel. To defend the honor of the princess," Brisford declared. Aldrich considered this. "Does the princess know you're defending her honor?" "That is irrelevant." Aldrich wiped his hands on his apron. "I'm just asking because, and I say this with all due respect, she seems like the type who would stab a man for speaking on her behalf without permission." Brisford drew his sword with a flourish. The blade gleamed in the firelight, sharp enough to split a hair mid-air. "Name your weapon." Aldrich looked around the kitchen. His options were limited. There were knives, but those seemed like overkill. There was a rolling pin, but he had seen what Mistress Drell could do with one, and wasn't confident he could replicate it. Then his gaze landed on the largest of the wooden spoons, a monstrous thing the size of a small club, its handle worn smooth from years of stirring, and presumably disciplining kitchen staff. He picked it up. It had a nice weight. "This," he said. Brisford stared. "A spoon." "A wooden spoon," Aldrich corrected. "Very different." The Lord's lip curled. "You cannot be serious." Aldrich hefted the spoon in both hands. "I once saw Mistress Drell take down a burglar with one of these. Broke his nose in 2 places. Granted, the burglar was actually just the butcher's apprentice who'd come to borrow salt, but the principle stands." Brisford looked like he wanted to argue, then seemed to decide that debating kitchenware with a peasant was beneath him. "Very well. The courtyard. At dawn?" Aldrich frowned. "Why not now?" "Because duels are at dawn," Brisford said, as if this were a fundamental law of nature. Aldrich shrugged. "Seems like an arbitrary rule, but all right." Brisford sheathed his sword with a dramatic sweep and strode out, leaving the kitchen in stunned silence. Mistress Drell was the first to speak. "You," she said, "are going to die." Aldrich tested the spoon's balance. "Probably, but it'll be funny." The next morning, the castle courtyard was packed. Word of the duel had spread like wildfire, and it seemed half the court had turned out to witness what promised to be either a bloodbath or a farce. Princess Seraphina, to Aldrich's surprise, was among them. She sat on a raised dais, her expression unreadable, though the way her fingers drummed on the armrest suggested she was either deeply annoyed or suppressing laughter. Brisford arrived in full dueling attire, a fitted jacket, polished boots, and a rapier so finely crafted it probably had its own name. He took his place with the practiced grace of a man who had spent years training for exactly this moment. Aldrich arrived late, still chewing a piece of toast. He had swapped his apron for a slightly cleaner tunic, and was carrying his spoon like a club. The crowd murmured. Someone snorted. A herald stepped forward. The terms of the duel are thus. First blood decides the victor. Combatants, salute your opponent. Brisford gave a flourishing bow, his blade sweeping in a perfect arc. Aldrich saluted with a spoon. The herald sighed. Big. Brisford lunged. Aldrich, who had no formal training in anything except avoiding angry geese, reacted on instinct. He dodged to the side and swung the spoon. It connected with Brisford's knee with a solid tunk-tunk. The Lord yelped, stumbling. The crowd gasped. Aldrich blinked. Tanz. Brisford recovered quickly, his face flushing with outrage. He attacked again, his rapier flashing in the morning light. Aldrich backpedaled, swinging the spoon wildly. It clattered against the blade with surprising force, knocking Brisford's strike off course. The crowd was beginning to murmur in earnest now. This was not how duels were supposed to go. Brisford, his composure slipping, feinted left and struck right. Aldrich, who had no idea what a feint was, simply flailed the spoon in what he hoped was a threatening manner. The spoon smacked Brisford square in the ribs. The Lord wheezed, doubling over. Aldrich hesitated. "Are you all right?" Brisford, red-faced and furious, straightened with a snarl. You insect!" He charged. Aldrich panicked. He swung the spoon like a man trying to ward off an angry wasp. The spoon connected with Brisford's wrist. The rapier clattered to the cobblestones. Silence. Then laughter. It started with a single snicker from somewhere in the crowd, then spread like wildfire. Nobles who had spent years enduring Brisford's bragging were suddenly clutching their sides, tears streaming down their faces. Even some of the guards were grinning behind their helmets. And then Princess Serafina laughed. Not the stifled, reluctant sound from before. This was a full, unrestrained laugh, bright and clear in the morning air. Brisford, his pride in tatters, snatched up his rapier and stormed off, his dignity in shreds behind him. Aldrich, still gripping the spoon, turned to the princess. "Does this mean I win?" Serafina wiped at her eyes, her composure slowly returning. "It means you're an idiot." Aldrich grinned. "But a victorious idiot." The princess sighed. "Gods." Aldrich's shoulders slumped. "Dongans?" "No, but—" Serafina stood, smoothing her skirts. "The stables. If he's going to swing things like a fool, he might as well muck out stalls." As Aldrich was led away, he glanced back at the princess. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her expression, something almost like amusement. Progress, he decided, was definitely being made. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the courtyard, Fendrel watched with a thoughtful frown. "Interesting," he murmured. Mistress Drell, who had come to retrieve her spoon, snorted. "Idiotic, you mean?" Fendrel chuckled. "Those two things are not mutually exclusive." Chapter 7. The Royal Gardener's Wisdom. The stables were, in Aldrich's opinion, a step up from the dungeons but a significant step down from the kitchens. At least in the kitchens there had been food. Here there was hay, and the distinct possibility of being kicked in the head by a horse that seemed to regard him with the same disdain as the nobility did. 3 days of mucking out stalls had left him sore, filthy, and covered in a fine layer of something he chose not to think about too hard. Still, he worked with a stubborn determination, humming tunelessly as he shoveled. It was during one of these labors that the royal gardener found him. The gardener was an old man with a face like a weathered root and hands, gnarled from decades of tending to plants that had no interest in being tended to. He leaned on his hoe, watching Aldrich struggle with a particularly uncooperative pile of manure. "You're doing it wrong," the gardener observed. Aldrich paused. panting. I'm fairly certain there's no right way to shovel horse droppings. The gardener chuckled. There's a right way to do everything, lad, even the things that seem beneath you. Aldrich leaned on his shovel. Nothing's beneath me at this point. Literally. He gestured to the stable floor. The gardener nodded sagely. Aye. And yet here you are, still trying to reach above your station. Aldrich frowned. You know who I am. Everyone knows who you are, the gardener said. You're the fool who thinks he can win a princess with a broken lute and a spoon. Aldrich opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Fair. The gardener gestured for him to follow. Come, take a break. My knees aren't what they used to be, and I could use a sit-down. Curious, Aldrich propped his shovel against the wall and followed the old man out into the castle gardens. They were a riot of color and order, meticulously arranged, yet somehow wild, as if the plants had agreed to behave just long enough to impress visitors. The gardener led him to a stone bench beneath an ancient oak, and sat with a groan. Aldrich hesitated, then sat beside him. So, are you here to tell me I'm wasting my time? Because I've heard that one already. The gardener shook his head. No, I'm here to tell you that you don't understand what you're chasing. Aldrich blinked. What do you mean? The old man plucked a leaf from a nearby bush and rolled it between his fingers. You see this plant? Looks delicate, doesn't it? Pretty little thing. But it's poisonous. Touch it wrong, and your hand will swell up like a sausage. Still pretty, though? He tossed the leaf aside. Royalties like that, all shine and venom. Aldrich frowned. Princess Serafina isn't poisonous. The gardener gave him a sidelong look. Isn't she? How many times has she had you thrown in the dungeons? That's different. She's just used to people doing what she says, the gardener finished. Used to being the sun around which everyone else orbits. You're a peasant, lad. You don't orbit, you dig, and no amount of wishing will change that. Aldrich stared at his hands, calloused and dirt-streaked. So you're saying I should give up? I'm saying you should ask yourself why you're doing this, the gardener said. Is it because you truly love her? Or is it because you like the idea of proving everyone wrong? Aldrich opened his mouth, then closed it. The gardener sighed. Royalty doesn't love like common folk do. Their hearts are tangled up in duty and politics and the weight of 1,000 expectations. Even if by some miracle she returned your feelings, what then? You think the court would accept you? You think the king would let his daughter marry a man who smells like horse dung and bad decisions? Aldrich scowled. I bathed last month. The gardener chuckled. My point is, lad, sometimes the things we want aren't the things we need. And sometimes the things we need are right in front of us, if we just stop staring at the stars long enough to see them. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. Then, that's very wise. The gardener shrugged. I'm old. Wisdom is what's left after everything else has been knocked out of you. He stood, groaning as his knees protested. Think on it, lad, and for the God's sake, take a bath. With that, he ambled off, leaving Aldrich alone beneath the oak tree. The princess was holding court in the rose garden that afternoon. Aldrich could hear the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. He could go to her now if he wanted. Recite another poem. Make another fool of himself. But for the first time since he'd arrived at the castle, he hesitated. The gardener's words rattled around in his skull like pebbles in a tin cup. Did he love Serafina? Or did he just love the idea of her? The challenge of her? He thought of her laughter during the duel, bright and unguarded. The way her nose scrunched up when she was trying not to smile. The way she'd had him thrown in the moat. He groaned and rubbed his face. This was all far too complicated. A rustling in the bushes startled him. He turned just in time to see a small figure dart behind a hedge. Curious, he crept forward and peered around the foliage. A child sat in the dirt, a girl no older than 6, her dress smudged with grass stains. She was attempting to braid flower stems together, her tongue poking out in concentration. She looked up as Aldrich's shadow fell over her. For a moment, they stared at each other. Then, "You're the spoon man," she said. Aldrich blinked. What? "The spoon man," she repeated, as if this were obvious. "The one who hit Lord Fancypants with the big spoon." Aldrich choked on a laugh. "Lord Fancypants?" The girl nodded solemnly. "Mama says I'm not supposed to call him that, but his pants gare fancy." Aldrich couldn't argue with that. He crouched beside her. "And who's your mama?" The girl pointed toward the rose garden. "She's the princess." Aldrich's stomach dropped. "You're Princess Seraphina's daughter." The girl, apparently the princess, rolled her eyes. "No, silly. She's my aunt. Mama's the Yuverd princess, the nice one." Aldrich had not known there was another princess. This seemed like the sort of thing someone should have mentioned. The little princess held up her sad little braid of flowers. "Do you think Aunt Sarah would like this?" Aldrich examined the drooping, half-crushed blossoms. "I think she'd love it." The girl beamed. Then her expression turned crafty. "Will you take it to her?" "She scares me a little." Aldrich hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he held out his hand. "Give it here." The princess handed him the braid with the gravity of a knight, bestowing a sacred relic. "Tell her it's from Lily." Aldrich nodded. "I will." As the girl scampered off, Aldrich looked down at the sad little braid in his hands. It was, without question, the least impressive gift anyone had ever tried to give Princess Seraphina. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and headed for the rose garden. Maybe the gardener was right. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. But then again, maybe fools were the only ones who ever changed anything. Chapter 8. The Peasant's Desperate Ploy. Aldrich stood at the edge of the rose garden, the little princess's wilted flower braid clutched in his hand. The gardener's words still echoed in his mind, but the sight of Princess Lily's hopeful face had shoved aside his doubts. Maybe he didn't belong here. Maybe this was all a fool's errand. But he had come this far, and he wasn't about to let a child down. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. Just as Princess Seraphina's voice cut through the murmur of courtiers, like a blade through butter. "No, Lord Brisford, I will not reconsider your proposal. Unless, of course, you'd like me to reconsider the distance from which I throw my next goblet at your head." The nobleman in question, still nursing wounded pride from the spoon duel, stiffened. "Your Highness, I only meant—" "What you menting was to waste my time," Seraphina interrupted, "and I have precious little of that to spare." Aldrich hesitated. This was not the ideal moment. But then again, when had he ever waited for an ideal moment? He cleared his throat. Loudly. Every head in the garden turned. Seraphina's gaze landed on him, her expression shifting from irritation to something perilously close to resignation. "You?" Aldrich bowed. "Badly. Am I? Why are you not in the stables?" "Technically, I was never given a curfew," Aldrich said. "So legally, it's ambiguous." One of the courtiers choked on a laugh. Seraphina's eyes narrowed. Aldrich pressed on before she could summon the guards. "I come bearing a gift." He held up the sad little flower braid. "From your niece, Princess Lily." For a fraction of a second, Seraphina's expression softened. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual mask of cool disdain. "Lily sent who?" "She said you scare her a little," Aldrich admitted. "Though in fairness, you scare everyone a little." A murmur rippled through the court. Brisford looked apoplectic. Seraphina studied the drooping flowers. "And you agreed to deliver it because—" "Because she asked." Aldrich said simply. Silence. Dip one. Then, to Aldrich's shock, Serafina took the braid. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers careful on the crushed petals. Tell her I said thank you. Aldrich grinned. I will. Brisford could no longer contain himself. Your Highness, surely you're not entertaining this. Peasant? Aldrich supplied. Buffoon, Brisford spat. Serafina sighed. Lord Brisford, if you don't cease speaking, I will have you reassigned to the moat cleaning detail, permanently. Brisford shut his mouth. Aldrich, emboldened, took a step forward. Your Highness, If your next words are another terrible poem, Serafina warned, I will throw you into the moat personally. Aldrich paused. He had planned to recite the ode to a flower braid most wilteding, but perhaps that was unwise. Desperation seized him. I possess a mythical treasure. The garden went silent. Serafina arched a brow. Do you? And Aldrich nodded, committing fully to the lie. Aye, the lost tear of Valmira, a gem said to hold the power of... Let me stop you there, Serafina said. I have no interest in mythical treasures. Aldrich blinked. But, it's mythical. And I, Serafina said, am practical. Gold doesn't rule kingdoms. Men with too much of it do. And legends are just stories told by people who want something. Aldrich's mouth opened, then closed. He had expected skepticism, even mockery, but indifference that he hadn't prepared for. Brisford smirked. Clearly, the peasant's grasp of courtly matters is as feeble as his lute skills. Aldrich ignored him, his mind racing. What do you care about, then? The question slipped out before he could stop it. The courtiers gasped. One fanned herself, as if she might faint. Serafina stared at him. No one, it seemed, had ever been so blunt. Then, to everyone's shock, she answered. Competence, honesty, the ability to why make a spectacle of oneself at every turn. Aldrich considered this. So, not me then. A flicker of something crossed Serafina's face. Amusement? Exasperation? No, she said. Not you. Aldrich nodded slowly. Fair. Brisford cites the moment. Your Highness, surely this audience is at an end. The peasant has embarrassed himself enough for one day. Serafina's gaze lingered on Aldrich for a heartbeat longer. Then she turned away. Court is dismissed. As the nobles dispersed, Aldrich stood rooted to the spot. He had gambled and lost. Worse, he had finally seen the truth in the gardener's words. Princess Serafina didn't want grand gestures or mythical treasures. She didn't want him. And for the first time, Aldrich wondered if that was all right. He turned to leave, and nearly collided with Fendrel, the princess' advisor. The old man studied him with those keen, unreadable eyes. The lost tear of Valmira, Fendrel mused. An interesting choice. Aldrich winced. Made it up on the spot. I know. Fendrel's lips quirked. There's no such gem. Aldrich sighed. I'm starting to think there's no such thing as a peasant winning a princess' heart, either. Fendrel was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, perhaps not the way you've been trying. Aldrich frowned. What's that supposed to mean? But Fendrel only smiled and walked away, leaving Aldrich alone in the garden with his thoughts and the crushing weight of reality. That night, as he lay in the hayloft, the stable master had taken pity on him and banished him to the loft instead of the dung pile. Aldrich stared at the rafters. He had come to the castle with dreams of love and grandeur. He would leave with nothing but sore muscles and a spoon-shaped bruise on his pride. And yet, he thought of Serafina holding that wilted flower braid. The way she hadn't laughed, hadn't mocked. She had simply accepted it. Maybe that was something. Maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Outside, the moon rose over Castle Valmir, its light cold and clear. Somewhere in the royal chambers, a princess tucked a crushed flower braid into a drawer. And somewhere in the stables, a peasant finally fell asleep. Chapter 9. The Princess Counteroffer. Aldrich had resigned himself to leaving Castle Valmir. He had no mythical treasures, no grand romantic gestures left to offer, and certainly no dignity remaining. The stables had been cleared of his meager belongings. A spare tunic, a half-carved wooden spoon he'd been shaping into a flute, badly, and a single sock whose mate had been stolen by what he suspected was a vindictive barn cat. He was just tying the last knot of his bedroll when the stable door creaked open. He expected Mistress Drell, come to scold him for lingering, or perhaps Fendrel, ready to deliver one last cryptic remark. What he did not, as I expect, was Princess Seraphina herself, standing in the doorway with the air of someone who had just stepped into a particularly unpleasant-smelling alley. Aldrich dropped the bedroll. It unspooled across the hay-strewn floor like a dying snake. Seraphina eyed it, then him. Leaving? Leaving? Aldrich swallowed. Yes. I thought it was time. Time, she repeated. Past time, really, Aldrich admitted. I think we both know this was never going to work. Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. Then, what if I gave you one last chance? Aldrich's head snapped up. What? The princess stepped further into the stable, her nose wrinkling slightly at the smell. A task. If you complete it, I might consider your suit. Aldrich's heart lurched. Might? Might, Seraphina confirmed. No promises. Aldrich studied her face. She was as unreadable as ever, but there was something in her eyes, something almost playful. It was terrifying. What's the task? He asked, wary. Seraphina smiled. It was the kind of smile a cat gave a mouse just before pouncing. I have a peacock. Aldrich blinked. I've seen it. Very feathery. He doesn't sing. Silence. Aldrich waited for the rest. It didn't come. And you want him to? Seraphina nodded. Teach him. If you can make my peacock sing, I'll hear your proposal properly. Aldrich opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. You do realize peacocks don't sing, yes? They screech, like a demon being stepped on. Seraphina's smile widened. Then you'll have your work cut out for you. Aldrich ran a hand through his hair. This is impossible. Is it? Seraphina tilted her head. You claimed you could win a princess with a spoon and a broken lute. Compared to that, a singing peacock seems almost reasonable. Aldrich groaned. You're enjoying this. Immensely, she admitted. Do you accept? Aldrich looked at his unspooled bedroll, at the stable, at the princess's infuriatingly perfect face. He had no prospects, no home to return to, and now, apparently, no common sense. When do I start? Seraphina turned to leave. Now, the bird's name is Percival. Try not to anger him. He bites. With that, she was gone, leaving Aldrich alone with the crushing weight of his own bad decisions. Percival the peacock was, in a word, magnificent. In another word, terrifying. He strutted around his gilded enclosure like a tiny, feathered tyrant, his iridescent tail fanned out in perpetual display. When Aldrich stepped into the aviary, the bird fixed him with a look of pure disdain. Right, Aldrich muttered. Zinging lessons. Percival let out a screech that could have shattered glass. Aldrich took a step back. Or we could start with scales. 3 hours later, Aldrich was slumped against the aviary wall, his ears ringing. Percival had spent the entire morning demonstrating his impressive vocal range, none of which could be considered musical. The bird now perched on a high branch, preening as if he had just delivered a performance worthy of the Royal Opera. Aldrich rubbed his temples. This is hopeless. A chuckle came from behind him. He turned to see Fendrel leaning on the aviary gate, watching with amusement. Having trouble? Aldrich gestured helplessly at Percival. He's tone-deaf, and possibly evil. Fendrel nodded sagely. Most peacocks are. Aldrich groaned. Why would she ask this? He knows it's impossible. Fendrel's expression turned thoughtful. Perhaps that's the point. Aldrich frowned. What do you mean? But Fendrel only shrugged and walked away, leaving Aldrich with more questions than answers. The days that followed were a blur of failed attempts. Aldrich tried whistling to Percival. The bird ate his sheet music. He tried playing the lute, badly. Percival attacked the strings. He even tried bribery with bits of fruit, which the peacock accepted before biting his fingers anyway. By the end of the first week, Aldrich was ready to admit defeat. He slumped into the castle kitchens, where Mistress Drell took one look at his peacock-plucked appearance, and wordlessly shoved a bowl of stew at him. She's toying with me, Aldrich muttered into his meal. Mistress Drell snorted. Obviously. Aldrich scowled. Then, why bother? Maybe she likes watching you try, the cook said, stirring a pot with more force than strictly necessary. Or maybe she's waiting to see if you'll figure it out. Aldrich paused. Figure what out? Mistress Drell gave him a look usually reserved for undercooked poultry. That you're asking the wrong question. Aldrich opened his mouth to argue, but the cook had already turned her back, ending the conversation. That night, as Aldrich lay staring at the aviary ceiling, he had taken to sleeping there, partly out of desperation, partly because Percival had stolen his bedroll. He turned Mistress Drell's words over in his mind. The wrong question. He had been asking how to make Percival sing. Maybe the real question was to try Seraphina had asked him to try. The answer came to him just as dawn broke, spilling golden light through the aviary bars. Aldrich sat bolt upright. Oh, who? Percival, startled from his roost, let out an indignant squawk. Aldrich scrambled to his feet, suddenly grinning. You brilliant, infuriating woman. He left the aviary at a run, not even flinching when Percival nipped at his retreating heels. He found Seraphina in the morning garden, sipping tea with her niece. Princess Lily beamed when she saw him. Spoon man, and Aldrich bowed. Properly for once, your highnesses. Seraphina set down her cup. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers tightened slightly around the handle. Have you come to admit defeat? Aldrich shook his head. No, I've come to tell you that Percival will never sing. Seraphina arched a brow. Then you fail. No, Aldrich said. Because that was never the real task, was it? The princess stilled. Aldrich pressed on. You didn't care if I could actually do it. You wanted to see if I'd figure that out. Lily looked between them, confused. Aunt Sarah, what's he talking about? Seraphina didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on Aldrich, something almost like respect flickering in her eyes. Aldrich took a deep breath. The real task wasn't the peacock. It was me. You wanted to see if I'd keep trying at something impossible, or if I'd finally learn when to stop. The garden was silent. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Then slowly Seraphina smiled. It was small, barely there but real. And what have you learned, Aldrich of nowhere important? Aldrich met her gaze. That some things are impossible, but that doesn't mean they're not worth attempting. Seraphina exhaled, a soft, surprised sound. Then she turned to Lily. Would you give us a moment, dear? Lily pouted but obeyed, skipping off with one last curious glance at Aldrich. When they were alone, Seraphina spoke. You're still a fool. Aldrich nodded. Probably. And you still smell like a stable. Definitely. Seraphina studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, come to dinner tonight. Aldrich's heart stuttered. What? Dinner? She repeated, as if speaking to a particularly slow child. In the small hall, 6th bell. Try not to wear anything with hay in it. Aldrich opened his mouth, closed it, then managed, Why? Serafina stood, smoothing her skirts. Because I find myself curious to hear what you'll say when you're not shouting poetry at me, or being attacked by poultry. And with that, she walked away, leaving Aldrich standing in the garden, sunlight warming his face, and the impossible weight of hope in his chest. Percival, watching from a nearby hedge, let out a screech that might have been laughter. Chapter 10. The Peacock's Rebellion. Aldrich stood in the aviary, staring down Percival with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. The peacock stared back, his jeweled feathers ruffled in clear defiance. The invitation to dinner with Princess Serafina still buzzed in Aldrich's veins like summer wine. But first he had unfinished business with this overgrown, ill-tempered bird. Listen, Aldrich began, keeping his voice low and reasonable. I don't want to be here any more than you do. But if you could just, I don't know, hum a single note, we could both move on with our lives. Percival tilted his head, his beady eyes glinting with something far too intelligent to belong to a bird. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised one clawed foot and stomped directly onto Aldrich's lute, crushing the already battered instrument with a sickening crack. Aldrich yelped. That was my last one. Percival let out a sound that was unmistakably smug. This was no longer a challenge. This was war. Aldrich had faced many indignities in his time at the castle. Dungeons, moats, spoons to the ribs, but being outwitted by a peacock was a new low. The bird had not only refused to sing, he had systematically sabotaged every attempt Aldrich made to teach him. Sheet music had been shredded. Treats had been stolen, and then disdainfully ignored. At one point, Percival had somehow gotten hold of Aldrich's spare tunic and turned it into a nest, leaving it streaked with iridescent feathers and what Aldrich dearly hoped was mud. And now, the lute. Aldrich scooped up the ruined instrument with a sigh. You know, most birds just poop on things they don't like. Percival fluffed his tail feathers, turning his back with regal disdain. Aldrich was still muttering to himself when he nearly collided with Princess Lily in the courtyard. The little princess was clutching a handful of wildflowers, her face lighting up when she saw him. Spoonman, did you make Percival sing yet? Aldrich sighed. I think Percival's idea of singing is the sound of my dreams dying. Lily giggled. Aunt Sarah says he's smarter than most lords. Aldrich couldn't argue with that. He knelt to her level. What are you doing out here? Picking flowers for Maman. Lily held up her bouquet, which consisted mostly of dandelions and one suspiciously leafy twig. She likes yellow. Aldrich smiled. That's very kind of you. Lily beamed, then leaned in conspiratorially. Are you really coming to dinner tonight? Aldrich's stomach flipped. Yes, if your aunt hasn't changed her mind. Lily shook her head. She won't. She told Uncle Fendrel she wants to see if you're as funny when you're not covered in moat water. Aldrich wasn't sure whether to be flattered or alarmed. That's good to know. Lily patted his arm. Don't worry. Aunt Sarah likes you. She just doesn't know it yet. With that sage pronouncement, she skipped off, leaving Aldrich standing in the courtyard, equal parts warmed and terrified. He had exactly 6 hours until dinner. 6 hours to find something to wear that didn't smell like hay or bird-related trauma. 6 hours to prepare himself for an actual conversation with Princess Serafina that didn't involve poetry, spoons, or bodily harm. First, though, he needed to deal with Percival. The peacock had taken up residence on the aviary's highest perch, watching Aldrich's every move like a feathered gargoyle. Aldrich squared his shoulders. Fine, you win. No more singing lessons. Percival blinked. Aldrich reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of dried berries, stolen from the kitchens at great personal risk. Truce? Percival eyed the berries. Then, with the air of a king granting a pardon, he hopped down and pecked them delicately from Aldrich's palm. Aldrich exhaled. Great. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a dinner to not ruin. Percival made a noise that might have been encouragement. Or indigestion. It was hard to tell with peacocks. The castle tailor took one look at Aldrich and sighed deeply. You're the peasant. Aldrich resisted the urge to point out that he was, technically, standing in a castle, which surely elevated him above mere peasantry. I need something to wear to dinner. Something... not this. He gestured to his current ensemble, which was mostly held together by stubbornness and a few strategic knots. The tailor pinched the bridge of his nose. I have a doublet that might fit. It was made for Lord Brisford's younger brother, but he, outgrew it. Aldrich didn't ask how one outgrew a doublet. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. An hour later, he stood before a polished mirror, staring at his reflection in disbelief. The doublet was a deep green, trimmed with silver thread that caught the light when he moved. It fit surprisingly well, though the sleeves were a touch too long, clearly made for someone who had never done a day's manual labor in their life. The tailor adjusted the collar with practiced fingers. Not bad. Try not to spill anything on it. Aldrich nodded, suddenly nervous. He had faced down angry geese, irate nobles, and a peacock with a grudge. Why was the thought of a simple dinner making his palms sweat? The answer, of course, was Princess Seraphina. At precisely the 6th bell, Aldrich stood outside the small hall, his heart pounding loud enough that he was half convinced the guards could hear it. He had washed. He had combed his hair, mostly. He had even borrowed a pair of shoes that didn't squelch. The doors opened. Princess Seraphina sat at the head of a modest table, her gown a deep blue that brought out the sharp silver of her eyes. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment Aldrich forgot how to breathe. Then she spoke. You're on time. I'm impressed. Aldrich bowed, properly this time, back straight, one hand behind him in the way he'd seen nobles do. I didn't want to risk being thrown in the moat again. Seraphina's lips twitched. A wise choice. She gestured to the seat across from her. Sit before you faint. Aldrich sat. The meal was simpler than he'd expected. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, a tart that made his eyes water with its sweetness. The conversation, too, was simpler. No poetry. No declarations of love. Just Seraphina asking about his village, his family, the stupidest thing he'd ever done. A long list, but the time he'd tried to ride a pig to market won by sheer embarrassment. And then, as the servants cleared the plates, Seraphina set down her goblet and said, Why me? Aldrich froze. Why what? You could have picked any girl in your village, Seraphina said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like she was bracing for an answer she didn't want to hear. Why come all this way for someone who's done nothing but mock you? Aldrich hesitated. The easy answer was to say she was beautiful, but that felt cheap. The truth was more complicated. Because you didn't pretend, he said at last. Everyone else in my life either laughed at my dreams or humored me. You treated me like I was worth taking seriously, even if it was just to tell me I was an idiot. Seraphina studied him. Then quietly, You are an idiot. Aldrich smiled. I know. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Seraphina stood. Walk with me. They strolled through the moonlit gardens, the night air sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. Aldrich's pulse still hadn't calmed, but the panic had eased into something warmer, something like hope. Then, from the shadows, came a rustle. Percival emerged like a vengeful spirit, his tail fanned in full display. He locked eyes with Aldrich and let out a screech that could have woken the dead. Seraphina sighed. I see you two have bonded. Aldrich groaned. He's plotting my death. Percival strutted closer, his head cocked in what Aldrich could only describe as avian malice. Then, with a sudden, graceful hop, the peacock landed on a low wall and began to sing. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even close to musical. But it was, undeniably, a song. A series of crooning, warbling notes that echoed through the garden, like a drunken minstrel's lament. Aldrich gaped. You horrible, brilliant bird." Percival fluffed his feathers, looking unbearably pleased with himself. Seraphina laughed. A real, full laugh that lit up her whole face. "Well, it seems you've completed your task after all." Aldrich turned to her. "Does this mean?" Seraphina's smile was small, but real. "It means I'll consider your suit." Percival chose that moment to vomit half-digested berries onto Aldrich's borrowed shoes. Seraphina patted Aldrich's arm. "Welcome to the family." And with that she walked away, leaving Aldrich standing in the moonlight with a victorious peacock, and the dawning realization that his life had just gotten infinitely more complicated. And, perhaps, infinitely better. Chapter 11. A Midnight Conspiracy. Aldrich had never been one for sneaking. His usual approach to life was more of a stumble forward and hope for the best philosophy. But tonight, creeping through the castle corridors with borrowed shoes in hand, he felt like a thief in his own story. It had started innocently enough. After the disastrous, yet somehow successful, Peacock serenade and the dinner that followed, he'd been too restless to sleep. The tailor had reclaimed the borrowed doublet, leaving him in his old tunic, though he'd managed to scrub most of the stable smell from it. He'd wandered the moonlit halls, replaying Seraphina's words in his head. "I'll consider your suit," until his feet had carried him without thinking to the small, secluded courtyard, where the princess often took her morning tea. That's when he'd heard the voices. "You're enjoying this far too much." Fendel's dry observation carried easily through the still night air. Aldrich had frozen, pressing himself against the ivy-covered wall. A familiar laugh sent his pulse racing. Seraphina thought. "He's ridiculous and persistent. It's refreshing." Aldrich's chest swelled. She thought him refreshing. That was good, wasn't it? Then Fendel spoke again, and the world tilted. "So the game continues." "Game, but I." The word landed like a stone in Aldrich's gut. "Of course." Seraphina's voice was light, amused. "Did you see his face when Percival actually made noise? I thought he might faint." A chuckle. "You realize he genuinely believes you might accept him. Don't be absurd." The dismissal in her tone cut deeper than any blade. "A peasant and a princess? It's a farce, Fendel. A diverting one, but a farce nonetheless." Aldrich didn't remember leaving. One moment he was standing there, the cold stone biting into his palms. The next he was striding blindly through the castle, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. A farce. A game. Everything. The dungeons, the moat, the spoon duel, the damned peacock. All of it just entertainment for a bored princess. He found himself in the aviary without conscious thought. Percival stirred on his perch, blinking sleepily at the intrusion. The moonlight turned his feathers to liquid silver. Aldrich slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat in the dirt. "You knew, didn't you?" Percival made a soft noise that might have been sympathy, or maybe indigestion. Aldrich dropped his head into his hands. He was a fool. A greater fool than even he'd realized. "Here you are." The voice sent Aldrich scrambling to his feet. Princess Lily stood in the aviary entrance, her nightgown glowing pale in the moonlight. She clutched a ragged stuffed bear in one hand. Aldrich hastily wiped at his face. "Your Highness, you should be asleep." Lily ignored this. "You're sad." Aldrich forced a laugh. It came out strangled. "Just tired. It's been a long—" "You heard, Aunt Sarah." The blunt statement stole Aldrich's breath. He stared at the child, suddenly aware that Princess Lily's wide eyes saw far more than most adults. Lily stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor. "She doesn't mean it." Aldrich's laugh was bitter. "She seemed to mean it." Lily shook her head, sending dark curls bouncing. "Aunt Sarah leaves when she's scared." Aldrich blinked. "Scared? Of what?" "You," Lily said simply. The absurdity of it nearly made Aldrich laugh again. "Princess, I'm about as threatening as a damp sock." Lily considered this. "Aunt Sarah doesn't like socks. They itch." She reached out, small fingers gripping Aldrich's sleeve. "She likes you. She just doesn't know how to say it." Aldrich looked down at the tiny hand clutching his dirty tunic. "Your aunt is a princess. I'm a peasant who smells like birdseed." Lily's nose wrinkled. "You do smell funny." Then, with the devastating honesty of children everywhere, but she smiled at dinner. She never smiled. Aldrich opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. Because Lily was right, Serafina Rat smiled. More than once, and not the sharp, mocking smiles she'd given him before, but real ones. Small and hesitant, but real. Percival chose that moment to hop down from his perch, strutting over to peck at Aldrich's boot. Lily giggled. "See? Percival likes you too." Aldrich eyed the peacock. "He vomited on my shoes." "That's how he shows love," Lily explained solemnly. Aldrich sighed. He was having a moral crisis in a birdcage, being comforted by a 6-year-old and a poultry with a grudge. His life had officially become stranger than any ballad. Lily tugged his sleeve again. "Don't go away." Aldrich hesitated. "I'm not sure I should stay." "You have to," Lily insisted. "Or Aunt Sarah will be sad." Aldrich doubted that very much. But as he looked at Lily's earnest face, something stubborn flared in his chest. He'd come this far, been thrown in the moat this many times. If he was going to leave, it wouldn't be slinking away in the night like a kicked dog. If this was a game, he'd play it to the end. And maybe, just maybe, he'd change the rules. Aldrich nodded slowly. "All right, I'll stay." Lily beamed and threw her arms around his legs in an impulsive hug. Percival took the opportunity to steal a button from Aldrich's tunic. As the first light of dawn crept over the castle walls, Aldrich made his decision. If Serafina wanted a game, he'd give her one she wouldn't forget. He just needed a plan, and possibly more buttons. Chapter 12. The Peasant's Revenge. Aldrich spent the morning in the castle archives, buried under a mountain of parchment so old it smelled like regret and dust. The royal librarian, a skeletal man with ink-stained fingers, had initially refused him entry, until Aldrich mentioned he was researching proper courtship etiquette by order of Princess Serafina. The lie slipped out smoother than he expected, aided by the fact that no one in their right mind would willingly subject themselves to castle bureaucracy without coercion. By midday he had his weapon. Tucked away in the e-compendium of royal protocols and precedents, volume the 7, subsection 43C, was a single glorious paragraph detailing the ancient right of peasants' petition, a law so archaic even the archivists had forgotten it existed. In summary, any commoner who completed 12 tasks set by royalty could demand an audience to present their case before the crown, provided they did so while wearing a hat made of turnips. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. Aldrich copied the passage with meticulous care, his quill scratching across the parchment. The tasks didn't specify what they had to be, only that they be given by royal decree. And thanks to Serafina's little game, he had already completed 11. Dungeons. Task 130. Mohat. Task 2. Duel. Spoon Duel. Task 3. All the way through teaching a peacock to sing, Task 11, though he suspected Percival's performance had been more mockery than cooperation. Only one task remained, and Aldrich knew exactly what it would be. He just needed the right hat. Finding turnips proved easier than expected. The kitchens were well stocked, and Mistress Drell was taking her afternoon nap. Aldrich selected 3 particularly lumpy specimens and set to work with some twine and a dull paring knife. The result looked like something a deranged scarecrow might wear to a funeral, but it would serve. Next came the hard part. Princess Serafina was holding court in the Sola when Aldrich arrived, resplendent in his turnip hat and a tunic that had seen better days. The nobles gathered around her turned as one, their expressions cycling through shock, amusement, and outright confusion. Lord Brisford was the first to recover. "Why in the 7 hells is that?" Aldrich ignored him, bowing deeply to Serafina. "Your Highness, I come before you to exercise my right of peasant's petition." A murmur ran through the crowd. Serafina's brow furrowed. "Your rule, would he?" Aldrich produced the parchment with a flourish. As documented in the E-Compendium of Royal Protocols and Precedents, Volume the Cephanus, subsection. "I don't care what volume," Serafina snapped. "Explain yourself." Aldrich met her gaze. "You set me 11 tasks, Your Highness. By law, I may demand a 12th to complete my petition." Fenrir, standing at Serafina's shoulder, plucked the parchment from Aldrich's hand. His eyes skimmed the text, then widened slightly. He leaned in, murmuring something to the princess too low for others to hear. Serafina's expression darkened. Then, abruptly, she laughed. "Very well. Your 12th task." She paused, considering. "Bring me the head of the Black Boar of Eldermere." Gasps rippled through the court. Even Fenrir looked startled. Aldrich kept his face carefully blank. The Black Boar was a legend, a monstrous beast said to dwell in the cursed forests beyond the kingdom's borders. Many had tried to hunt it. None had returned. It was, in other words, an impossible task. Exactly as Serafina intended. Aldrich bowed again. "As you command." As he turned to leave, Brisford snorted. "You'll be dead by sundown." Aldrich adjusted his turnip hat. "Probably, but a way to go." The journey to the Eldermere woods should have taken 2 days. Aldrich made it in 1, spurred on by equal parts determination and the sinking suspicion that this was, in fact, a terrible idea. The woods loomed ahead, dark and unwelcoming. The trees twisted into shapes that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. Aldrich took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows. He found the boar, or rather, the boar found him, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was enormous, its black hide scarred from countless battles, its tusks yellowed and sharp as daggers. It regarded Aldrich with small, intelligent eyes, snorted once, and charged. Aldrich, who had spent the last several months surviving moat-water, peacock assaults and courtly politics, did the only sensible thing. He climbed a tree. The boar slammed into the trunk with enough force to shake leaves loose. Aldrich clung to the branches, his heart pounding. Nice boar, good boar. The boar snorted again and began circling, clearly content to wait him out. Hours passed. Aldrich's arms ached. The boar showed no sign of leaving. Then inspiration struck. Aldrich reached into his pouch and pulled out the last of his stolen kitchen treasures, a slightly squashed raspberry tart. He held it out. "Hungry?" The boar sniffed. Aldrich tossed the tart. The boar caught it mid-air, swallowed it in 1 gulp, and made a noise that might have been pleasure. Aldrich grinned. "I know where there are more." Convincing the boar to follow him back to the castle was easier than expected. The promise of food worked wonders, as did the occasional scratch behind the ears. Once Aldrich was certain those ears wouldn't lead to his immediate demise. By dawn they stood at the castle gates, where the guards took 1 look at the massive beast and promptly fainted. Aldrich strolled into the courtyard, the boar at his heels like an oversized, ill-tempered dog. Courtiers scattered, shrieking. Brisford, to Aldrich's immense satisfaction, climbed onto a bench and stayed there. Serafina appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale. "What have you done?" Aldrich bowed. "As commanded, Your Highness, the head of the Black Boar of Eldermere." He gestured to the beast. "I thought you might prefer it attached, more decorative that way." The boar, sensing it was the center of attention, flopped onto its side with a contented grunt. "Silence. Silence. Then—" "You absolute madman," Serafina breathed. Aldrich met her gaze. 12 tasks completed, Your Highness. I believe that earns me an audience." For a long moment, Serafina just stared at him. Then she turned on her heel and strode inside, the court parting before her like wheat before a scythe. Fender lingered, his expression unreadable. "That," he said finally, "was either the stupidest or the bravest thing I've ever seen." Aldrich removed his turnip hat, now slightly worse for wear. "Is there a difference?" Fender didn't answer. But as he walked away, Aldrich could have sworn he saw the old man smile. The boar, now snoring loudly in the middle of the courtyard, rolled onto its back, all 4 legs in the air. Aldrich sighed. "You're not helping." The boar farted in response. Somewhere in the castle, Princess Serafina was either drafting his execution order or reconsidering her life choices. Aldrich wasn't sure which he preferred. But one thing was certain. The game had changed. And this time, he was winning. Chapter 13. The Great Turnip Heist. Aldrich sat in the hayloft, scratching the black boar behind its ears as he plotted his next move. The beast had taken up permanent residence in the castle courtyard, much to the dismay of the gardeners and the delight of the kitchen staff, who had discovered it had an insatiable appetite for vegetable scraps and Lord Brisford's discarded silk handkerchiefs. But Aldrich had no time to celebrate his latest absurd victory. The completion of his 12 tasks meant he was owed an audience with the princess, a real audience, not one where she could dismiss him with a wave of her hand or a well-aimed goblet. He needed a spectacle, something so undeniably chaotic that Serafina would have no choice but to listen. And he knew exactly where to start. Mr. Strell was elbow-deep in bread dough when Aldrich slipped into the kitchens. The head cook fixed him with a glare that could curdle milk. "If you're here to steal more turnips, I'll skin you myself." Aldrich grinned. "Actually, I'm here to offer you a deal." The kitchen staff, who had been pretending not to listen while absolutely listening, inched closer. Mistress Drell wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm listening." 10 minutes later, Aldrich had secured the allegiance of every disgruntled kitchen worker in the castle. Their grievances were many: low wages, long hours, the fact that Lord Brisford once sent back a perfectly good pheasant because it looked at him funny. By the time Aldrich finished outlining his plan, even the normally stoic potato peeler was grinning. Operation Turnip Storm was a go. The following morning, the castle awoke to chaos. It began innocently enough. A single turnip rolling down the grand staircase during breakfast. Then another. And another. By the time the 5th turnip bounced off Lord Brisford's knee, the throne room was in an uproar. "What is the meaning of this?" Serafina demanded, rising from her throne as a particularly robust turnip sailed past her shoulder. The doors burst open. Aldrich entered, flanked by a small army of kitchen staff armed with sacks of root vegetables. He wore his original turnip hat, now reinforced with what appeared to be carrot crossbeams for structural integrity. At his side, the black boar snorted eagerly, clearly hoping some of the vegetables would land within Snout's reach. "Your Highness!" Aldrich bellowed over the din. "I believe you owe me an audience." A turnip smacked a courtier in the chest. Someone screamed. Serafina's eyes blazed. "This is not an audience. This is a vegetable-based insurrection." Aldrich shrugged. "You set the terms. I'm just following protocol." He gestured to the kitchen staff, who began lobbing turnips with startling accuracy at the most pompous-looking nobles. Fendrel, who had taken cover behind a tapestry, peered out. "Technically, he's correct." Serafina whirled on him. Whose side are you on? The side of historical precedent, Fendrel said mildly, ducking as a turnip whizzed past his ear. Lord Brisford chose that moment to make a break for the door, only to slip on a strategically placed squash and go down hard. The black boar, seeing opportunity, immediately began gnawing on the man's boot. Aldrich stepped forward, the chaos swirling around him. "Princess Serafina," he said, pitching his voice to carry, "I have completed your 12 tasks. By the laws of this kingdom, you must hear my petition." For a moment, he thought she might refuse. Then, with a sigh that spoke volumes about the state of her mourning, Serafina waved a hand. The turnip bombardment ceased. "Fine," she snapped. "Speak, dot fine. Nui." Aldrich took a deep breath. This was it. No poetry. No serenades. Just the truth. "I love you," he said simply. The throne room went silent. Even the black boar paused in its boot chewing. Aldrich continued. "Not because you're a princess, not because it's some grand adventure, but because you're sharp and stubborn and smarter than anyone I've ever met. Because you laugh at my terrible jokes even when you're pretending not to. Because—" "Enough," Serafina interrupted. Aldrich's heart sank. Then she stepped down from the dais, her gown sweeping across the turnip-strewn floor. She stopped mere inches from him, her silver eyes searching his face. "You're a fool," she said softly. Aldrich nodded. "I know. And you smell like root vegetables." "Also true," Serafina exhaled. Then, before the entire court, before the bewildered nobles and the grinning kitchen staff and the boar still working on Brisford's footwear, she kissed him. It was brief. It was perfect. And when she pulled away, Aldrich, for perhaps the first time in his life, was speechless. Serafina smirked. "Now, that's how you make an impression." The throne room erupted. Kitchen staff cheered. The black boar, finally succeeding in separating Brisford from his left boot, trotted proudly to Aldrich's side and deposited the soggy prize at his feet. Fendrel, surveying the scene, nodded to himself. "Well, that went better than expected." Aldrich, still dazed, touched his lips. "Did I just win?" Serafina linked her arm with his. "Let's call it a draw." And as the castle staff began the long process of cleaning up the great turnip heist of 23, Aldrich realized something wonderful. He was home. The boar belched contentedly. Somewhere, Percival the Peacock screeched in what might have been approval. And Princess Serafina, against all odds and better judgment, held his hand. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. The Princess' Unexpected Laughter. The morning after the great turnip heist, Castle Valmir awoke in a state of bewildered silence. The throne room still smelled faintly of root vegetables. Lord Brisford walked with a slight limp from where the black boar had enthusiastically sampled his footwear. And Princess Serafina, much to the shock of the entire court, had not ordered anyone executed. Aldrich found himself summoned to the royal solar at an hour so early even the kitchen fires were barely lit. He arrived with his hair sticking up in 3 separate directions, and the distinct feeling he might still have turnip pulp in his ear. Serafina sat at her writing desk, already immaculate in a gown the color of storm clouds. She did not look up as he entered. "You're late." Aldrich blinked. "You didn't specify a time." "I shouldn't have to." She finally lifted her gaze, and Aldrich was startled to see something dangerously close to amusement in her silver eyes. "Do you know how long it will take to clean the throne room?" Aldrich considered this. "If Mr. Strell's staff is involved, I'd say 20 minutes? Serafina's lips twitched. "Try 3 days. The herbalist claimed the smell of crushed turnip lingers." Aldrich couldn't help himself. He grinned. So it was a memorable petition, then. To his shock, Serafina laughed. Not the sharp, mocking sound he'd come to expect, but something warm and rich that filled the solar like sunlight. It transformed her face entirely, softening the angles of her cheekbones, crinkling the corners of her eyes. Aldrich stared. Serafina caught his expression and immediately schooled her features back into their usual regal disdain. But the damage was done. Aldrich had seen it, the real laughter, unguarded and genuine. "You," she said, pointing a quill at him, "are a menace." Aldrich bowed. "Your menace, if you'll have me." The quill froze mid-air. Serafina's eyes narrowed. "Is that a proposal?" Aldrich's mouth went dry. It could be. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant clatter of pots from the kitchens below. Then Serafina set down her quill with deliberate precision. "Do you know why I laughed just now?" Aldrich shook his head. "Because you're ridiculous," she said. "But you're also the only person in this entire castle who doesn't treat me like I'm made of glass, or worse, like I'm a prize to be won." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "You threw turnips at my court. You made a peacock sing. Badly. You somehow convinced the most dangerous beast in the kingdom to follow you home like a lost puppy." Aldrich opened his mouth to protest, then remembered the black boar currently snoring in the stables, belly full of stolen apples. Serafina stepped closer. "I spent years building walls high enough to keep everyone out. And you just climbed over them like they weren't even there." Aldrich's heart pounded. "Is that a good thing?" "It's an infuriating thing," Serafina said. But she was close enough now that Aldrich could see the gold flecks in her eyes, could count the faint freckles dusting her nose. Then, softer, "But yes, it's good." Somewhere in the castle, a door slammed. The noise seemed to startle them both back to reality. Serafina cleared her throat. "There will be conditions, of course." Aldrich nodded solemnly. "No more turnips in the throne room?" "Definitely no more turnips. And you'll have to learn at least basic court etiquette." "I can bow without falling over now." "And," Serafina continued, ignoring this, "you'll need an official title." Aldrich considered. "How about royal menaces? Try Lord Protector of the Realm's Sanity." Serafina deadpanned. Aldrich grinned. "Bit long for business cards." Serafina rolled her eyes, but the effect was ruined by the way she couldn't quite suppress another laugh. Outside, the castle was waking properly now. Servants bustled past the solar door. Somewhere, Percival the Peacock announced the morning with his usual ear-splitting screech. And Aldrich, standing in a patch of sunlight with a princess who laughed at his jokes, realized something wonderful. He'd won. Not the way he'd imagined, perhaps. There would be no grand ballads about his triumph. No minstrel singing of the peasant who conquered a princess' heart. But there would be breakfast. And possibly more turnips, though not in the throne room. And Serafina's laughter, bright and unexpected as sunlight through storm clouds. That, Aldrich decided, was better than any ballad. The black boar chose that moment to crash through the solar door, trailing a half-eaten tapestry and looking immensely pleased with itself. Serafina sighed. "And it thigh will be your responsibility." Aldrich scratched the beast behind its ears. "Worth it," he declared. And for once, Serafina didn't argue. Chapter 15. A Lesson in Humility. Aldrich had imagined his triumph would feel different. He had expected fanfare, or at the very least, a modicum of respect. Instead, he found himself standing in the middle of Castle Vanira's grand hall, surrounded by nobles who stared at him as though he were a peculiar insect that had somehow learned to wear clothes. Lord Beresford, still limping slightly from the black boar's enthusiastic appreciation of his footwear, leaned toward a cluster of courtiers and muttered something that made them titter behind their gloved hands. Aldrich resisted the urge to throw a turnip at him. Princess Serafina had granted him the title of Lord Protector of the Realm's Sanity, a jest that had sent the court into fits of laughter. But now, as he stood in the polished boots and doublet that had been forced upon him, he realized something unsettling. He missed his old tunic. He missed the stables. He missed the simplicity of being Aldrich the peasant, who answered to no one but the occasional angry goose. And most troubling of all, he wasn't entirely sure he had ever truly wanted the princess's affection. The realization struck him like a bucket of cold water. He had spent months chasing Serafina, convinced that winning her heart was the pinnacle of his ambitions. But now that he stood within arm's reach of her, now that her laughter was no longer a rare treasure, but something he could coax out with a well-timed joke, he felt nothing. Or rather, naughty nothing. But not what he had expected. He liked Serafina, admired her even. She was sharp-witted and bold, and the way she handled the court's endless politics with effortless grace was nothing short of mesmerizing. But love? Aldrich wasn't sure he knew what that word meant anymore. Lost in thought, my lord? Fendel's voice startled him from his musings. The old advisor stood beside him, sipping from a goblet of wine with the air of a man who found the world endlessly amusing. Aldrich grimaced. "Don't call me that." Fendel chuckled. "It is your title now. Only because Serafina thought it was funny. And is that so terrible?" Fendel's eyes gleamed with something knowing. "To be a source of amusement for a princess?" Aldrich hesitated. "I thought I wanted her to take me seriously. And now?" Aldrich exhaled, running a hand through his hair, a habit that earned him a disapproving glare from a nearby noblewoman. "Now I think I just wanted to prove I could." Fendel took a slow sip of his wine. "Ah, so it was never about her at all." The words settled over Aldrich like a weight. He had been so caught up in the chase, in the sheer absurdity of his own audacity, that he had never stopped to ask himself why he was doing it. He had wanted to be seen, to matter. And now that he did, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Across the hall, Serafina held court with her usual effortless command, her silver eyes flicking toward him occasionally, not with the warmth he had glimpsed in the solar, but with something calculating. Assessing, Gildanipition, Amon, Nissen, Mr. Libidofi Haroksansikne, in the Berich. Mustard da. Aldrich suddenly felt like a bug pinned to a board. He turned to Fendel. "What do I do now?" The old man smiled. "That, my boy, is entirely up to you." Aldrich groaned. "That's not helpful." "It wasn't meant to be." Fendel clapped him on the shoulder. "But if it's any consolation, I don't think the princess ever wanted your love either." Aldrich blinked. "What?" Fendel's smile turned wry. "She wanted someone who wouldn't bow and scrape, someone who would make her laugh, someone who reminded her that life doesn't always have to be so God's damned serious." He nodded towards Serafina. "Look at her, really look." Aldrich did. And for the first time he saw past the crown, past the regal poise, to the woman beneath. A woman who had been raised to be a symbol, not a person. A woman who had spent her life locked in a gilded cage of duty and expectation. A woman who had laughed at his turnips not because she was cruel, but because for the first time in years, someone had given her permission to. Aldrich's chest tightened. He didn't love her. Not the way the ballad spoke of love, but he understood her. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more. The black boar chose that moment to barrel into the hall, sending courtiers scattering with indignant shrieks. It skidded to a stop at Aldrich's feet, panting happily, a half-chewed chew dangling from its mouth. Aldrich sighed. "You're a terrible influence." The boar snorted and dropped the shoe at his feet like a trophy. Fendel chuckled. "I believe that's your cue." Aldrich scooped up the ruined footwear, Brisford's if the monogram was any indication, and tossed it back to the boar, who caught it mid-air with a gleeful chomp. Then he straightened his doublet, as much as one cock straightened a doublet that had been slept in, and strode across the hall toward Serafina. The court fell silent as he approached. Serafina arched a brow. "Yes?" Aldrich bowed, not the practiced, courtly bow he'd been taught, but his old, slightly off-kilter one. "Your Highness, I've come to resign my post." A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles. Seraphina's expression didn't change, but Aldrich saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Resign?" Aldrich nodded. "Turns out I'm terrible at protecting sanity." Also, the boar ate another shoe. For a long moment, Seraphina simply stared at him. Then, to the shock of everyone present, including Aldrich, she laughed. Not the polished, restrained laughter of court, but the real, unfettered sound he had only heard a handful of times. "Fine," she said when she'd recovered. "But on one condition." Aldrich braced himself. "Let me guess. The moat?" Seraphina's lips curved. "You have to stay." Aldrich blinked. As whatever you want to be." She shrugged, the movement deliberately casual, but Aldrich didn't miss the way her fingers tightened ever so slightly on the arms of her chair. "Courtiesta, Stabelmaster, professional turnip enthusiast. I don't care." Aldrich's throat felt strangely tight. "And if I choose to be your friend?" Seraphina met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no mockery in her silver eyes. Only something that looked suspiciously like relief. "Then I suppose I'll have to endure your terrible jokes." Aldrich grinned. "Deal, Duel." And as the court erupted into scandalized whispers, as Brisford turned an alarming shade of purple, as the black boar happily demolished another shoe, Aldrich realized something. He hadn't won the princess' heart, but he had, against all odds, won something far more valuable. Her friendship. And for a man who had spent his life chasing dreams he wasn't sure he even wanted, that was more than enough. Somewhere in the distance, Percival the Peacock let out a triumphant screech. Aldrich took it as a sign of approval. Enough. Chapter 15. Chapter 16. The Gardener's Farewell. Aldrich's belongings, what few he had, were packed into a sack that had once held grain. The black boar lounged by the stable doors, gnawing contentedly on a saddle strap that no one had been brave enough to reclaim from its jaws. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of hay and damp earth. He had thought leaving would be harder, but as he stood in the courtyard, watching the castle stir to life, Aldrich felt only a quiet certainty. The gardener found him there, kneeling beside a patch of late-blooming roses. The old man's hands were crusted with soil, his face as lined and weathered as the bark of the ancient oak that shaded the castle walls. "So?" the gardener said. Aldrich nodded. "Seems so." The gardener grunted, crouching beside him to inspect the roses. "Never took you for the sensible type." Aldrich chuckled. "Me neither." They worked in silence for a while, the gardener pruning dead blooms while Aldrich tied his sack shut. The boar snorted in its sleep, twitching as it dreamed of whatever monstrous creatures dreamed about, probably more shoes. Finally, the gardener spoke again. "You could stay, you know. Princess wouldn't mind." Aldrich glanced at the castle windows, where the first lights of dawn glowed behind leaded glass. "I know." "Then why go?" Aldrich picked up a fallen rose petal, turning it between his fingers. "Because I never came here for her. Not really." The gardener paused, his shears hovering over a thorny stem. "Ah, I thought I wanted to win her heart," Aldrich said. "Turns out, I just wanted to prove I was worth something." The gardener snipped the stem with a decisive click. "And are you?" Aldrich smiled. "Enough to know when it's time to walk away." The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good answer." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small withered thing, a seed pod dried and cracked with age. "Take this." Aldrich accepted it gingerly. "What is it?" "Story goes it's from the first rose planted in this castle's gardens," the gardener said. "Probably nonsense, but it's a good reminder." "Of what?" The gardener stood, groaning as his knees protested. "That the best stories don't end the way you expect." He dusted his hands on his trousers, leaving smears of earth. Think about it. What kind of tale would yours be if you'd actually won the princess? Married her, lived happily ever after in some gilded cage. Aldrich made a face. Terrible. Exactly. The gardener's grin was crooked, missing a tooth. But this, a peasant who walked into a castle, turned everything upside down and then walked away. That's a story worth telling. Aldrich pocketed the seed pod. You're surprisingly wise for a man who talks to plants. And you're surprisingly clever for a man who fought a duel with a spoon. The gardener clapped him on the shoulder. Go on then, before the boar eats something truly important. Aldrich shouldered his sack. The castle loomed behind him, all turrets and tradition already fading into the morning mist. Somewhere inside, Princess Serafina was probably giving some poor servant hell for folding the napkins wrong. Fendrel was no doubt sipping his morning tea and plotting something devious. The kitchen staff would be elbow-deep in dough, laughing about the great turnip heist for years to come. And Aldrich? Aldrich had a road ahead of him, and a story that wasn't finished yet. He whistled to the boar. Come on, you great brute. Let's go find some trouble. The beast lumbered to its feet, shook itself like a dog, and trotted after him. As they passed through the castle gates, Aldrich didn't look back. But if he had, he might have seen a flash of silver at an upper window, a princess watching him go, her expression unreadable. And if he'd listened very closely, he might have heard the distant, indignant screech of a peacock, as if even Percival was surprised by how this story ended. Or didn't end, because the best stories never really do. End of chapter 16. End of the Peasant and the Princess. Chapter 17. The road home. The road back to his village was longer than Aldrich remembered. Or perhaps it was simply that he walked slower now, his boots kicking up dust in time with the black boar's leisurely plodding. The beast had steadfastly refused to be left behind, trailing him like a particularly ugly shadow, occasionally veering off to root through bushes, or frighten the occasional passing merchant. Aldrich had given up trying to explain its presence. People either screamed and ran or offered it food, and the boar was perfectly content with both reactions. The first familiar fields appeared just as the sun began its descent, the golden light turning the thatched roofs of the village into smudges of honey against the green. Aldrich paused at the crest of the hill, his sack suddenly heavy on his shoulder. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the smell of wood smoke and turned earth, the way the evening air carried the distant clatter of pots from open windows. The black boar snorted beside him, nudging his leg with its snout as if to say, "Well?" And Odyssey. Aldrich took a deep breath and started down the path. The disbelief began almost immediately. Old Nan was the first to spot him, her cabbage stall nearly toppling as she scrambled out from behind it. "Aldrich, that you, boy? We thought you were dead." "Mostly just embarrassed," Aldrich admitted. Nan's eyes bulged as the boar snuffled at her cabbages. "And what in the seven hells is Ithtak?" "His name's Reginald," Aldrich lied smoothly. The boar, perhaps sensing it was being insulted, promptly knocked over a basket of turnips with its hindquarters. Nan shrieked. Aldrich tossed her a coin from the modest purse Serafina had pressed into his hand at parting. "For the turnips," she'd said dryly, and hurried on before she could demand more answers. The commotion drew others from their homes and shops, until Aldrich found himself at the center of a growing crowd, their questions overlapping like the clucking of startled hens. "You really met the princess? Did you actually fight a lord with a spoon? Is it true you taught a peacock to sing opera?" Aldrich held up his hands, one story at a time. They gathered at the village tavern, where the innkeeper, a grizzled man who had once thrown Aldrich out for attempting to pay in acorns, actually bought him a drink. The boar settled under the table with a contented grunt, promptly beginning to snore. And so, for the first time in his life, Aldrich found himself the center of attention for something other than mockery. He told them of the dungeons, the moat, the disastrous poetry. He described Percival's awful singing and the great Turnip heist in lavish detail. He even demonstrated the proper way to duel with a spoon, much to the delight of the children who had squeezed into the tavern to listen. And when he finished, when the last tale had been spun and the last laugh had faded, the village blacksmith, a man who had once called Aldrich the laziest farmhand in the valley, clapped him on the back so hard he nearly choked on his ale. "You're a damn fool," the blacksmith said fondly. "But I'll be damned if you're not the most interesting fool we've got." Aldrich grinned into his mug. It wasn't quite a ballad in his honor, but it was close enough. Later, as the tavern emptied and the boar snored on beneath the table, Aldrich found himself staring at the seed pod the gardener had given him. He rolled it between his fingers, the dry husk catching on his calluses. The innkeeper paused as he wiped down the tables. "What's that, then?" Aldrich shrugged. "A reminder." "Of what?" "That the best stories don't end where you expect." He tucked the pod back into his pocket. "And that turnips are criminally underrated." The innkeeper snorted. "You're mad." "Probably." Aldrich stretched, yawning. "But I'm home." And as the fire crackled low in the hearth, as the boar's snores rattled the tankards on the table, Aldrich realized something with quiet certainty. He hadn't needed to win a princess' heart to find his worth. He just needed to come back and see himself through the eyes of those who'd known him all along. Outside, the first stars blinked awake over the village. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and a mother called her children inside. The world was small here, ordinary in ways that castles and crowns could never be. Aldrich took a deep breath, the familiar sense of home filling his lungs. The boar farted in its sleep, and in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. End of chapter 17. Final chapter of the Peasant and the Princess. Chapter 18. The Princess' Secret Letter. Winter had settled over the village like a well-worn blanket when the letter arrived. Aldrich was mending the fence around his modest cottage, a task made infinitely more difficult by the black boar's enthusiastic help, when the post-rider reined in his horse at the gate. "You Aldrich the Turnip?" the rider asked, eyeing the boar warily as it snuffled at his boots. Aldrich wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "It's just Aldrich now, but I." The rider thrust a folded parchment at him. Sealed with wax, the color of storm clouds. Stamped with a familiar crest. Aldrich's heart stuttered. The boar, sensing his distraction, immediately head-butted the fence post he'd just fixed, sending it toppling into the mud. The rider didn't wait for a response, spurring his horse back down the lane with what Aldrich suspected was profound relief. Inside the cottage, with the boar temporarily bribed into stillness with an old loaf of bread, Aldrich broke the seal. The parchment unfolded like a secret, revealing a single line of elegant script. Peacock has learned to swear. You would appreciate his creative phrasing. No signature. No instructions. Just those 12 words, as cryptic and infuriating as the woman who'd written them. Aldrich read it 3 times before laughing aloud. The boar, startled by the noise, swallowed the loaf whole and promptly sneezed crumbs across the floor. Winter passed in a haze of ordinary moments, mending roofs for neighbors, trading stories for ale at the tavern, fending off the boar's increasingly bold attempts to sleep inside by the fire. The letter remained tucked in Aldrich's pocket, the parchment growing soft at the edges from constant handling. Spring came, and with it, another letter. This one arrived on a day when the village children had tied flowers in the boar's bristles, transforming the beast into a particularly fearsome maypole. The same storm-gray seal. The same elegant hand. Lord Brisford attempted to compose a sonnet in my honor. I nearly threw myself into the moat. Your terrible poetry was somehow less offensive. Consistency. Aldrich grinned. Then frowned. Then read it again. This wasn't just correspondence. This was a challenge. A continuation. The boar, sensing his distraction, ate the ribbon tied around its flowers. Summer burned the fields golden. The village celebrated the harvest with music and dancing, and Aldrich found himself demonstrating proper spoon-dueling technique to a gaggle of delighted children. He'd just fended off an enthusiastic 6-year-old when the third letter arrived. No post-rider this time. Just a scrap of parchment slipped into his hand by a traveling minstrel who winked and vanished into the crowd before Aldrich could ask questions. This note was shorter, more dangerous. Your castle needs a proper fool. The position is yours if you're willing to risk it. And see, nun done. Aldrich stared at the words until they blurred. The boar, having successfully stolen an entire pie from the feast table, trotted over and nudged his knee with its snout. Aldrich sighed. We both know where this is going, don't we? The boar belched in response. It took 3 days to pack his meager belongings. 3 days for the village to descend on him with a mix of exasperation and fondness, pressing gifts into his hands, a jar of honey from old Nan, a new spoon, ceremonially blessed for dueling, from the blacksmith, an alarming quantity of turnips from just about everyone. On the morning of the 4th day, Aldrich stood at the same hill where he'd first glimpsed the village upon returning. The boar waited beside him, its flower chain replaced with a garland of braided turnip greens. Behind him, the life he'd built. Ahead the road, and somewhere beyond that, a castle. A peacock. A princess who sent letters like thrown gauntlets. Aldrich adjusted his pack, the gardener's seed pod a quiet weight in his pocket. Come on, you great brute, he said. Let's go be fools. The boar snorted, and together they walked into the next chapter. End of chapter 18. Our chapter of Peasant and the Princess.